Every morning before sunrise, Daniel sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the wall where old paint peeled like tired skin. The room was small, barely large enough for the bed, a broken chair, and a rusted metal cupboard that no longer closed properly. The air always felt cold, even in summer, as if the walls themselves had learned how to hold on to exhaustion. He would sit there for a few minutes, not praying, not thinking loudly, just breathing, slow, controlled breaths, preparing himself for another day that would demand more than it ever gave back. He tied the same worn-out shoes every day. The laces were frayed, knotted in places where they had snapped before. The soles were thin, uneven, shaped by years of standing on concrete floors and factory tiles. Daniel knew exactly how many steps he could take before the ache started, how the pain would crawl from his feet up into his calves, settle into his knees, and finally make its home in his lower back. He accepted it the way some people accept weather. Unavoidable, indifferent, always returning. In the other room, his son Ethan slept. Daniel always paused before opening the door, careful not to make a sound. He watched his son the way one might watch something fragile and priceless. Ethan's face was calm in sleep, untouched by the sharp lines that life would eventually carve. Daniel noticed small details most people would miss: the way Ethan's brow tightened when he dreamed, the uneven rhythm of his breathing, the faint scar on his chin from a childhood fall Daniel still blamed himself for. He never woke him, never kissed his forehead, never said, "I love you," before leaving. Not because he didn't feel it, but because those words felt too light for the weight of what he carried. To Daniel, love was not something spoken in the morning. It was something proven by coming back at night with food on the table and rent paid on time. Daniel was a man who spoke less than he felt. At work, his co-workers described him as reliable, quiet, invisible. He clocked in early, clocked out late, and never lingered. He didn't join conversations in the break room. He didn't complain about overtime or unfair schedules. When supervisors needed someone to cover an extra shift, they didn't ask. They assumed Daniel would nod and accept. And he always did. Silence had become his armor. Words, in his experience, were dangerous things. They raised expectations. They created promises that life often enjoyed breaking. Daniel had grown up in a house full of loud words, shouted hopes, exaggerated dreams, constant assurances that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow never was. His father talked big and failed bigger. Daniel learned early that silence at least never lied. At home, that silence followed him like a shadow. Ethan would come home from school and talk about teachers he disliked, friends who annoyed him, dreams that shifted weekly. Daniel listened while fixing a leaking tap or folding laundry with hands too rough for soft fabric. He nodded at the right moments. He made sure dinner was ready. But when Ethan looked at him, waiting for encouragement, for approval, Daniel's throat tightened. The words gathered, pressed against his chest, and stayed there. Ethan mistook this silence for distance. Children often do. To him, his father felt like a closed door, always present, always firm, but never open. He didn't understand that behind that door lived a storm of emotion Daniel had no language for. A fear that if he spoke his hopes out loud, the world would hear them and crush them just to prove a point. Daniel believed deeply in one thing, that his son deserved more than he had been given. More choices, more safety, more chances to fail without being destroyed by it. That belief guided every decision he made, even the smallest ones. He skipped meals without telling anyone. He wore the same clothes year after year. He ignored pain until it screamed loud enough to interrupt his work. At night, when the house finally fell quiet, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the day. He thought about Ethan's future in fragments, college brochures he couldn't afford yet, jobs his son might one day apply for, cities he might move to. In these private moments, Daniel talked more than he ever did during the day. He imagined conversations where he told Ethan how proud he was, how strong he was, how every sacrifice was intentional. In his imagination, Ethan listened. In real life, Daniel stayed quiet. He feared that if he started talking, he might never stop. That years of swallowed frustration, love, regret, and hope would pour out uncontrollably. And if that happened, he might break. A broken man couldn't provide. A broken man couldn't protect. Silence again felt safer. People often mistake quiet men for empty ones. Daniel was full, too full. Full of responsibility, full of worry, full of a constant dull anxiety that hummed beneath everything he did. He worried about getting sick, about losing his job, about Ethan making one mistake that would close doors forever. These fears didn't make him louder. They made him smaller, more careful, more withdrawn. Every paycheck, Daniel separated money with precision. Rent first, utilities next, food, school supplies. Anything left over went into a small envelope hidden behind the cupboard. Ethan didn't know about it. No one did. It wasn't labeled, but in Daniel's mind, it had a name, just in case. Just in case something went wrong. Just in case he couldn't keep going. Just in case Ethan needed an escape. Daniel never expected gratitude. He didn't imagine future speeches or thanks. He only hoped, silently, that, one day, when Ethan looked back, the gaps would make sense. That the absence of words would be understood as presence of effort. That the distance wasn't neglect, but protection. But hope is a fragile thing when it's never shared. It bends inward, it becomes heavy. Daniel carried it alone, day after day, step after aching step, convinced that silence was strength, and that love, if it was real enough, would eventually explain itself. He didn't know that children don't always learn love from what is given, but from what is shown. And Daniel, for all his sacrifices, never learned how to show the one thing his son needed most, that behind the silence lived a heart that beat entirely for him. Daniel's life was measured not in years but in shifts. Day shift, night shift, overtime, emergency cover. His phone alarm rang at times most people never saw on a clock, and when it did, he silenced it immediately, as if even sound was a luxury he couldn't afford. The warehouse smelled of oil, dust, and tired bodies. Rows of metal shelves rose like cages, and Daniel moved between them with practiced efficiency, lifting, stacking, recording numbers that blurred together by midday. He knew the weight of every box without reading the label. His arms remembered what his mind no longer questioned. The supervisors trusted him because he never argued. Co-workers respected him because he never slowed down. No one asked how he was doing. In a place like that, survival depended on not asking. Darnie. Elle blended into the machinery of labor so completely that sometimes he wondered if he would still exist if he stopped moving. So he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Hope lived in him like an unpaid debt. It wasn't loud or inspiring. It was heavy, constant, and exhausting. Every time Daniel bent down to lift another crate, that hope pressed against his spine. Every time he swallowed pain instead of taking a break, it tightened its grip around his chest. This hope wasn't about dreams of wealth or comfort. It was smaller, sharper, more urgent, that Ethan would never stand where he stood, counting hours instead of living them. After the warehouse, Daniel cleaned office buildings downtown. At night, the city looked different, quieter, almost apologetic. The same offices that buzzed with importance during the day stood empty, their lights dimmed, their carpets untouched. Daniel moved through them with a mop and bucket, erasing the footprints of people who earned more in a day than he did in a week. He cleaned desks where important decisions were made, decisions that would never include people like him. Sometimes, while wiping down glass tables, Daniel imagined Ethan sitting behind one of those desks someday. Not cleaning it, but owning it. That image was enough to keep his hands moving when his wrists burned and his vision blurred from exhaustion. He never said this hope out loud. Saying it might have made it fragile. Saying it might have invited disappointment. So he carried it silently, letting it carve lines into his face and stiffness into his walk. Money passed through Daniel's hands like water through fingers. He touched it briefly, then sent it away to places it was needed more. Bills were paid before they became threats. Groceries were bought with careful calculation, choosing the cheapest options without sacrificing nutrition. Ethan never went to bed hungry. It was a victory Daniel celebrated quietly, alone, while washing dishes late at night. He denied himself things automatically, without thought. New clothes, doctor visits, days off. These weren't sacrifices to him, they were habits. He learned to ignore the warning signs his body sent him, the tightness in his chest after climbing stairs, the numbness in his fingers, the headaches that pulsed behind his eyes. Rest felt dangerous. Rest felt like the first step toward failure. At home, Daniel's presence was functional, efficient, and emotionally distant. He fixed broken shelves, replaced light bulbs, left money on the kitchen table when Ethan needed school supplies. He never explained where it came from or how hard it was to earn. He believed explanations were unnecessary. Results were what mattered. Ethan interpreted this practicality as indifference. He didn't see the nights Daniel sat alone, counting expenses again and again, afraid he'd missed something. He didn't see the fear that settled into Daniel's stomach every time the phone rang late, worried it might be bad news from work or school. To Ethan, his father's silence felt like absence, even when Daniel was physically present. Hope, when unshared, begins to isolate. Daniel felt that isolation deeply but couldn't name it. He watched Ethan grow more independent, more withdrawn, and told himself it was normal. Teenagers pull away, he thought. This is just life. But somewhere inside him, a quiet panic stirred. What if his silence wasn't protecting his son, but pushing him away? Still, he said nothing. Daniel believed that suffering quietly was honorable, that enduring without complaint made a man strong. This belief had been passed down to him, like an inheritance he never wanted but felt obligated to accept. He wore it heavily, mistaking endurance for love, sacrifice for connection. He didn't realize, though. While he was building a future for Ethan, he was also building a wall between them. Some nights, the exhaustion was so deep it felt physical, like a weight pressing him into the mattress. Sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of work, of boxes that never emptied, floors that never stayed clean. In these dreams, Ethan was always somewhere ahead of him, walking quickly, never turning around. Daniel tried to call out, but no sound came. He woke with his heart racing, breath shallow, hope heavier than before. On the bus rides between jobs, Daniel sometimes closed his eyes and imagined a different life, not for himself, but for his son. A life where Ethan could fail safely, where mistakes didn't mean hunger or homelessness, where hope wasn't something you carried alone in silence. These thoughts brought him comfort and pain in equal measure. Comfort because they gave meaning to his suffering, pain because he feared they might never come true. Daniel's hope was not optimistic, it was desperate. It clung to the belief that sacrifice automatically translated into success. That if he gave enough, worked enough, endured enough, the world would eventually reward his son. He never questioned whether the world worked that way. Questioning it would have made everything unbearable. He avoided mirrors. When he did catch his reflection, he barely recognized himself. His face looked older than his age. His eyes carried a dullness that hadn't been there years ago. Still, he straightened his shoulders and went on. He told himself appearance didn't matter. Longevity did. Just keep going, he thought. Just a little longer. Daniel never spoke of fear, but it followed him constantly. Fear of injury, fear of layoffs, fear of being replaced by someone younger, stronger, cheaper. Fear that one unexpected expense would collapse everything he had built. These fears didn't make him cautious. I made him relentless. He worked through illness. He skipped breaks. He accepted shifts that pushed his body beyond reasonable limits. The weight of hope does strange things to a man. It convinces him that his pain is insignificant compared to the future he imagines. It teaches him to measure his worth by how much he can endure without breaking. Daniel didn't realize that hope, when it becomes too heavy, doesn't lift. It crushes. Ethan noticed his father growing quieter, more withdrawn. Conversations became shorter, eye contact rarer. Daniel told himself it was temporary. Once things stabilized, once there was enough saved, once Ethan was older, he would talk. He would explain everything. There would be time. But time is indifferent to intention. Each day Daniel woke up and carried the same hope forward, unaware that it was slowly consuming him. He believed silence was strength. He believed sacrifice would speak for him. He believed hope, no matter how heavy, was something a man should carry alone. And so he did, until his body began to protest in ways he could no longer ignore, until the weight he carried started pressing not just on his spirit, but on his heart itself. The day Daniel didn't come home began like every other. There was no warning, no sense of finality, no dramatic pause in the rhythm of his life. He woke before the alarm, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for his breath to settle. His chest felt tight, tighter than usual, but he told himself it was nothing. He had learned to translate pain into inconvenience, and inconvenience was something he could work through. He dressed quietly, tied the same worn shoes, and glanced once toward Ethan's room before leaving. The door stayed closed. Daniel preferred it that way. Goodbyes felt unnecessary, almost indulgent. At the warehouse, the air felt heavier than usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed faint. High overhead, casting everything in a tired, artificial glow. Daniel clocked in and began moving boxes, each one familiar, predictable. His body moved on memory more than intention. Halfway through the morning, the tightness in his chest returned, sharper this time, spreading into his left arm. He paused for a moment, hand pressed against a shelf, breathing slowly. Someone nearby joked about needing coffee. Daniel forced a small smile and went back to work. He told himself it would pass. It always did. By early afternoon, the pain no longer waited politely in the background. It interrupted his thoughts, broke his rhythm. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold air of the warehouse. His vision blurred at the edges. Still, he didn't ask for help. He didn't want attention. Attention led to questions. And questions led to answers he couldn't afford to face. He thought of Ethan, of rent, of the envelope hidden behind the cupboard. He lifted another box. When Daniel finally collapsed, it wasn't dramatic. There was no cry for help, no final speech. His knees buckled, his body folded inward, and he hit the concrete floor with a dull sound that barely cut through the noise of machines. For a moment, people assumed he had tripped. It took seconds too long for someone to realize he wasn't getting back up. An ambulance came. Sirens echoed briefly, then faded. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, the world narrowing to fragments. White lights, voices without faces, the sharp smell of antiseptic. Somewhere in that haze, he felt relief, not because he wanted to die, but because he couldn't lift anything anymore. For the first time in years, his body refused to obey him. At home, evening arrived quietly. Ethan came back from school, dropped his bag near the door, and noticed the apartment felt different, too quiet. Dinner wasn't started. The lights were off. He'd check. Cared the time, and frowned. His father was never late. Not once. Ethan waited, scrolling on his phone, telling himself there was a reasonable explanation. Overtime, a delayed bus, something normal. Hours passed. Night settled in. Anxiety crept up slowly, disguising itself as irritation. Ethan tried calling Daniel's phone. No answer. Again. Still nothing. He told himself not to panic. His father hated phones, probably left it somewhere. Still, a tightness formed in his stomach, unfamiliar and unwelcome. The call came close to midnight, an unfamiliar number. Ethan almost ignored it. Almost. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, distant. Hospital. Emergency. Your father. The words landed unevenly, like stones thrown into water. Ethan wrote down the address with shaking hands, barely hearing the rest. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and old fear. Ethan followed signs, corridors stretching endlessly in all directions. Everything felt too bright, too clean, too quiet. A nurse led him to a room filled with machines. Daniel lay on the bed, smaller than Ethan remembered. Tubes ran from his arms. A monitor beeped steadily, impersonally. It sounded like a clock counting down. Ethan stood there, unsure what to do. He had imagined his father as unbreakable. Seeing him like this felt wrong, almost obscene. He waited for Daniel to open his eyes, to say something simple and practical, something that would restore order. Nothing happened. The machines spoke instead. A doctor explained things in careful terms: heart failure, severe strain, years of overwork. Words like critical and complications floated in the air. Ethan nodded, pretending to understand. All he could think was that his father had never mentioned being sick. Not once. The silence that once felt like distance now felt like betrayal. A nurse approached quietly and handed Ethan a small envelope. "This was in his jacket," she said. "We thought you should have it." The envelope was worn, creased from being carried too long. Ethan recognized his father's handwriting immediately. It made his throat tighten. He didn't open it right away. He sat beside the bed, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, watching his father's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. Memories surfaced uninvited. Silent dinners, brief nods, money left on the table without explanation. All the times Ethan had assumed his father didn't care enough to ask, to talk, to try. Hours passed. The night deepened. Nurses came and went. The doctor returned once, his expression unchanged. Sometime before dawn, the beeping slowed. Then it stopped. There was no dramatic moment. No final words. Just a flat, continuous sound that meant something irreversible had happened. A nurse turned off the monitor. The room felt suddenly empty, as if something essential had been removed from the air itself. Ethan sat frozen. He didn't cry at first. Grief didn't arrive as sadness, it arrived as confusion. 1,000 questions pressed against his mind with nowhere to go. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you say anything? Eventually, when the room felt too quiet to bear, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, edges soft from being handled again and again. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if each word had been chosen with effort. If you're reading this, I probably failed to say what mattered. I wasn't silent because I didn't care. I was silent because I was afraid my words wouldn't be enough. Everything I did was for you. Be more than tired. Be more than afraid. Ethan read it once. Then again. The words settled slowly, painfully. The silence he had resented all his life suddenly had a shape, a reason. It wasn't emptiness. It was fear. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of failing even with love. The realization hurt more than anger ever could. In the days that followed, Ethan moved through life in a haze. Arrangements were made. Paperwork signed. Condolences offered. People described Daniel as hard-working, dependable, quiet. Ethan listened, feeling like they were describing a stranger and a familiar figure at the same time. At home, the apartment felt hollow. Daniel's absence was louder than his presence had ever been. Ethan found the envelope behind the cupboard. Inside was money, neatly arranged, more than Ethan expected. Each bill felt heavy in his hands. This was what silence had built. This was what it had cost. Grief arrived fully then, not as tears but as understanding. Ethan saw his childhood differently. The missed conversations weren't neglect. They were fear disguised as strength. The distance wasn't lack of love. It was love miscommunicated. But understanding didn't bring relief. It brought regret. Regret for every time Ethan had dismissed his father. For every moment he had chosen silence in return. For never asking the questions that might have changed something. Daniel had carried hope alone until it killed him. And now, standing in the ruins of that hope, Ethan realized something darker still. Silence doesn't just protect. Sometimes it prevents rescue. Years passed, but the silence Daniel left behind never faded. It changed shape, settled into corners of Ethan's life, followed him into rooms where no one knew his name. Time softened the sharpest edges of grief, but it did not erase it. Instead, it transformed it into something heavier, understanding. And understanding, Ethan learned, can be more painful than ignorance. Ethan moved out of the apartment a year after his father's death. He told himself it was practical. Too many memories. Too small. Too quiet. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. The walls still felt like they were listening. Every creak at night sounded like Daniel coming home late. Every untouched corner reminded Ethan of a man who had filled space without ever demanding it. Leaving felt like survival. He carried the letter everywhere for a long time. Folded carefully, then refolded. The paper grew thinner with use. He read it during sleepless nights, on buses, in waiting rooms. Each time, the words hit differently. Sometimes they felt like an apology, other times like a confession, and sometimes like a warning he had received too late. Ethan began to notice patterns in himself that scared him. He worked too much. He avoided asking for help. He swallowed stress until it manifested as headaches and chest tightness. When friends asked how he was doing, he said, "Fine," and meant nothing by it. Silence, he realized, had been taught to him not through words but through example. That realization frightened him more than grief ever had. He remembered moments he had dismissed as meaningless. His father sitting quietly at the table, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. Daniel watching him leave for school without saying a word. The way he always seemed tired, but never rested. Ethan had once believed strength looked like that. Now he saw it differently. Strength, without release, was just slow destruction. When Ethan married, he promised himself things would be different. He spoke more. Or at least, he tried. But habits learned in childhood do not disappear easily. When life became stressful, when bills piled up and expectations pressed in, his first instinct was still silence. It felt familiar, safe, deadly. The birth of his first child changed something fundamental inside him. Holding that small, fragile life, Ethan felt fear in its purest form. Not fear of failure, but fear of repeating history. He looked down at his child's face and understood, with terrifying clarity, how his father must have felt. Overwhelmed by love, paralyzed by responsibility, desperate to protect. That night, while the baby slept, Ethan took out the letter again. He read it slowly, deliberately. For the first time, he didn't focus on what his father hadn't said. He focused on what he had meant. Daniel hadn't trusted words because life had taught him they were fragile. But Ethan now knew something his father never learned. Silence doesn't strengthen love. It starves it. Ethan began to speak deliberately, even when it felt uncomfortable. He told his child stories. He said, "I'm proud of you," even when the accomplishment was small. He said, "I'm scared," when he didn't know the answers. Each word felt like resistance against an inheritance he refused to accept. Still, Daniel was never far from his thoughts. On difficult days, Ethan imagined his father watching quietly from somewhere unseen, nodding approvingly, still saying nothing. The image brought both comfort and sadness. Daniel had never needed recognition, but he had deserved it. As years went by, Ethan found himself telling people about his father, not the quiet man who worked himself to death, but the man who loved so deeply he mistook silence for protection. He spoke of sacrifice without romance, of endurance without praise. He told the story honestly, without softening the darkness. Because that darkness mattered. It was the truth. One evening, long after his children had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, but not empty. He realized something then that felt both simple and devastating. His father's hope had worked. Ethan had choices, he had stability, he had a voice, but the cost of that hope had been a life lived half-expressed. Daniel never saw the future he built. He never heard the gratitude he earned. His hope had no witness while he was alive. Ethan folded the letter one last time and placed it in a drawer, not to forget it, but to free himself from carrying it like a wound. The message had done its work. It had taught him what silence could hide, and what it could destroy. Some fathers leave behind advice, some leave wealth. Daniel left a warning written in exhaustion and absence, that love unspoken can be mistaken for indifference, that hope carried alone can become fatal, and that strength without vulnerability is not strength at all. Ethan stood up, turned off the light, and walked toward his children's rooms. He paused at the doorway, listening to their steady breathing. For a moment, he felt the weight of generations pressing on him. Then he spoke softly, even though they couldn't hear him. "I'm here," he said, and in that moment, the silence finally broke, not with noise but with truth. Thank you for watching till the end. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Thank you.